She had $15, not in a wallet, not folded in a pocket, flat against her palm the way you hold something when you know it's the last of something. A 10 and a 5. Soft from years of other people's hands. Behind her sat a car with a cracked windshield and a heater that hadn't worked since October. Inside that car, 2 children waited, her daughter 17, her son 14. Old enough to understand, young enough that understanding still hurt. In 2 hours, Marin Ashby would walk into a government building and raise her hand. She would offer $15 for a condemned house that nobody wanted. A house the city had been trying to demolish for years. A house that looked from the outside like something that had already given up. They would laugh at her. They would take photographs, post them online. Her ex-husband would see those posts and add his own comment, and it would get 200 likes before her daughter saw it. But here is what none of them knew. Not the developers in their pressed shirts. Not the mayor behind his leather chair. Not the ex-husband who had spent 8 years quietly moving their life into accounts she couldn't touch. Beneath the rotting floors of that condemned house, a dead man had buried the truth. And that truth had been waiting 130 years for someone desperate enough to find it. She had $15. Not in a wallet, not folded neatly in a pocket somewhere safe. Flat against her palm. The way you hold something when you know it's the last of something. A 10 and a 5. Soft from years of other people's hands. Creased down the middle from being folded and unfolded too many times by fingers that were counting and recounting and still coming up with the same answer. $15. The bench was cold. The kind of cold that finds the gap between your collar and your skin and just lives there. November in Caldwell, Michigan had a way of doing that, of getting inside things, of settling into spaces that were supposed to be sealed. Marin Ashby sat very still. Behind her across the thin strip of parking lot, her car sat at the curb. A Honda Civic the color of old pewter, with a crack running from the lower left corner of the windshield up toward the rearview mirror, like a river finding its way. The heater had stopped working in October. She had told the kids it was a quirk. She had told herself she would get it fixed. She had not gotten it fixed. Inside the car, 2 children waited. Faye was 17. She sat in the passenger seat with her knees pulled up and her arms folded, and her eyes on the middle distance, the particular expression of a teenager who has decided that watching is safer than hoping. She had her mother's jaw, her father's eyes, and something behind those eyes that was neither of theirs, something that had developed entirely on its own in the last 8 months. A kind of watchfulness that hadn't been there before. Colt was 14. He sat in the back quietly the way he did most things. He had a book open on his lap, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching the back of his sister's head. Then, the back of the bench where his mother sat. Then his hands. Then, starting over. They were good children. That was the thing that made it hardest. They were so good. They had adapted to every contraction of their circumstances without complaint, without accusation, with a grace that children their age should not have had to develop. Faye had taken a job at a coffee shop on Main Street, telling the owner she was 18 when she was not, and she brought her tip money home in a small jar and left it on the kitchen counter without comment, without expectation, without making Marin feel anything except the specific grief of being helped by someone you were supposed to be protecting. Colt had stopped asking for things, not gradually. All at once sometime in September, like a switch. He wore shoes that were too small and walked to school without mentioning it. And when Marin had noticed him shifting his weight one evening, favoring his left foot, and asked, He had looked up and said his feet were fine, just tired from gym. They were not fine. She had cried in the bathroom that night, quietly, the way she had learned to cry in the last 8 months, with the faucet running. The money had lasted 3 months. $3,000. That was what the court had decided. That was the number that represented 18 years of her life. 18 years of school lunches packed at 6 in the morning, and client dinners hosted on 2 days' notice, and Christmas cards addressed in her handwriting, but signed with both their names. $3,000 and the hollow right to keep a last name she did not want, that she woke up every morning still carrying because she could not afford the filing fee to put it down. She had used it carefully, or tried to. Food for 3. School supplies. A winter coat for Colt, who had grown 4 inches since the previous year, and whose old one wouldn't zip. Shoes for Faye, whose soles had split. Rent on the apartment on the east side of Caldwell, the side where the gutters sagged and the sidewalks heaved, and the people who worked in Douglas's developments couldn't afford to live in them. The money lasted until the second week of October. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday. 3 days. She had 3 days to vacate or face legal proceedings. Maren had read the notice twice, standing at the mailbox in the cold. Then she had folded it along its original crease and walked upstairs and put it in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus and the extra batteries and the things she was not ready to look at yet. Then she had made dinner, pasta with the sauce from a jar. Garlic bread she made herself because it was cheaper, and because the act of making something, even something small, felt like a form of resistance she couldn't name. Faye had known. Faye always knew. She hadn't said anything. She had eaten her pasta and helped clear the table and gone to her room and texted 2 of her friends something that made them respond with long strings of emoji, and none of it was about the eviction notice, and all of it was about the eviction notice, and Maren had stood at the sink washing dishes and understood that her daughter was protecting her, and not known what to do with that. That was 8 days ago. Now she sat on the bench with $15 and tried to think. Her parents were in Arizona, retired, living carefully on checks that covered their own rent and not much else, and they were too old and too proud and too far away, and asking them would cost more than money. Her sister had died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Quick and terrible, and still not finished with Maren even now, because there were mornings she reached for the phone to call her before remembering. Her friends. The ones she'd had when she was Mrs. Douglas Ashby. The ones who had come to her dinner parties and complimented her cooking, and borrowed her advice about caterers and contractors and the right way to handle a difficult mother-in-law. Those friends had gone quiet in February when the separation became public. By April, they were posting photos with Douglas at the charity gala. By June, they had stopped texting altogether. She had not replaced them. There had not been time. There had not been money. There had not been the particular kind of emotional bandwidth required to introduce yourself as a new person to people who might decide you weren't worth knowing. So she sat, on a bench, in the cold, with $15, and nowhere to go, and 2 children in a car behind her who deserved a mother who had a plan. And then she saw the banner. It hung between 2 lampposts on the far side of the square, slightly tilted the left corner, drooping lower than the right. The kind of municipal announcement you drove past 100 times without reading because you were never the person it was for. She read it now. City of Caldwell, condemned property auction. Today, 2 p.m., City Hall. Maren looked at the banner for a long time. Then she looked at the $15 in her hand. Then she looked at the banner again. The thought that entered her mind was not a smart thought. It was not the thought of someone with options. It was the thought of someone who had been sitting on a cold bench for 40 minutes, trying to find a direction, and had just noticed a door she hadn't seen before, and couldn't know yet whether it opened onto something or nothing. Maybe there would be something at that auction so broken, so beyond repair, so completely unwanted by anyone with money or sense that it could be had for almost nothing. Maybe there would be a structure, just a structure, with walls and a roof and a door that locked, where her children could sleep tonight without counting down. Desperate. She knew that. But desperation, she was learning, had its own kind of clarity. She stood up. She put the $15 in her coat pocket. She walked toward City Hall. The auction room was on the second floor. Wood-paneled, low-ceilinged, smelling of burnt coffee and the particular mustiness of a room that held meetings no one looked forward to. Folding chairs arranged in rows, a podium at the front, a city seal on the wall that someone had hung slightly off-center and no one had ever corrected. There were roughly 30 people inside, almost all men. Almost all wearing the kind of business casual that communicated money held without effort, worn lightly, like a jacket you've had so long you've stopped noticing it. Several of them were developers Marin recognized from the years when she had been the person who arranged the catering for Douglas's investor meetings. She had known their drink orders. She had remembered their wives' names. She had refilled their water glasses without being asked. Not one of them looked at her now with recognition. Correction. One did. He was standing near the window speaking to another man in a charcoal blazer. And when Marin walked in, he turned, and his eyes found her, and processed her, and moved on in less than 2 seconds. But in that 2 seconds, she saw the flicker. Recognition. Then, adjustment. Then the face settling back into neutral, because she was no longer a person who required a social response. She sat in the back row. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. The auctioneer was a city employee named Frank Burrell. Broad across the shoulders, voice like gravel being shifted in a bucket, the expression of a man who had long ago made his peace with the gap between the job he had imagined having and the job he actually had. He worked through the properties with practiced efficiency, no flourishes, no enthusiasm. A vacant commercial lot went for $14,000. A former dry cleaning building with foundation issues went for $38,000. A residential property 2 blocks from the lake went for $26,500. Numbers that lived in a world Marin no longer had access to. She had almost stood to leave. She had gotten as far as putting her hands on her knees and shifting her weight forward when Burrell shuffled his papers and called the final item. His voice dropped half a register. The way voices do when reading something the speaker has already decided is beneath discussion. Last property. Condemned residential structure on 2 acres. 1247 Briarlock Road. Built 1891. Vacant since 1986. Severe structural deterioration. No active utilities. City of Caldwell holds the tax lien. Sold as is where is no warranties expressed or implied. Opening bid. Let's say $500. Nobody moved. $500. Burrell tried again with the tone of a man who already knew. $300. Come on, people. It's 2 acres. Nothing. $100. The city is authorized to accept any reasonable offer. We need this property transferred. More nothing. The developers were checking phones, gathering coats. One of them leaned toward his neighbor and said something that made them both exhale a small laugh. Burrell looked up from his papers. He sighed. It was the sigh of a bureaucrat who has performed this particular ritual enough times to know the ending without needing to see it. Fine. What will someone give me? Anything. For 2 acres and a condemned building. Marin's hand went up. She did not decide to raise it. It went up the way hands go up in dreams without the usual negotiation between impulse and action. From somewhere below thought. From the place where mothers make decisions that have nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the specific arithmetic of necessity. Her children needed a roof. Any roof. A condemned roof on 2 acres was still a roof. $15. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the silence before. Before had been the silence of indifference. This was the silence of a room recalibrating. Then someone in the third row laughed, and then it moved. The way laughter moves in a room where one person has given everyone else permission. First a sound, then another, then the whole low rumble of 30 people finding the same thing funny, which is one of the most efficient social machines that exists, because once it starts, the only way to stop it is to no longer be the subject of it. Maren sat in the back row. She did not look down. Burrell looked at her. His face did not hold mockery. It held something closer to genuine disorientation, like a man who has run this process hundreds of times and encountered a variable the process did not account for. "Ma'am, did you say $15? "Yes." $15. It's what I have. You said you'd accept anything. No one else is bidding. Burrell looked around the room. "Anyone," he said. "For the record." Nothing. The laughter had settled into something quieter. The room was watching now, the way rooms watch when they realize a joke might be becoming something else. Then Burrell said, 1247, Briarlock Road, condemned structure, on 2 acres sold for $15. See the clerk for your paperwork. And the laughter came back softer this time, more dispersed, the kind that follows someone out of a room. Maren walked to the clerk's desk at the side of the room. She heard fragments behind her. $15 for a death trap. Someone called Douglas. She's going to freeze to death in there, and the city's going to get sued. The clerk was a woman named Agnes Holbrook. 63 years old, reading glasses on a beaded chain hair the color of pewter, pulled back at the base of her neck. She had the bearing of a woman who had processed 30 years of municipal paperwork and could not be surprised or hurried. She worked through the deed transfer with professional quiet printing and stamping and dating with the kind of practiced economy that comes from doing something the same way for a very long time. When she handed Maren the deed, she lowered her voice. "You understand, this property is condemned. You cannot legally occupy it until it meets minimum habitability standards. The city has been attempting to demolish it for years. The process stalled in litigation with the previous lien holder, and it's been in legal limbo since. You're inheriting a complicated situation. I understand." Maren took the deed. "But it's mine." Agnes studied her for a moment. The way people study faces when they're trying to read something the face isn't saying. Then she reached down and opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the one that required a slight pull because it swelled in humid weather, and removed a small envelope. It was the kind of yellowing that happens to paper stored in a drawer for so long it has become part of the drawer. The kind of yellow that is not decay, but time. "This was in the original property file," Agnes said. "It was there when I started this job. 31 years ago. Marked for the owner, but there hasn't been an owner to give it to. Not one who came in person. Not one who signed the deed themselves." She held it out. "Until now." Inside the envelope was a key. Not a modern key. An iron skeleton key, heavy for its size, dark with age, the bow shaped like a clover leaf, and the teeth worn smooth from years of what she could only assume was use, though it was impossible to know what lock or what door or what room it had last opened before someone decided it needed to be kept. There was no note, no explanation, just the key and the envelope, and on the front of the envelope handwriting that had faded to the color of old rust. 3 words. For the owner. Maren stood in the doorway of Caldwell City Hall with a condemned deed in one hand and an iron key in the other, while behind her, very faintly, she could still hear people laughing. She walked to the car. The night that Douglas had told her he was leaving, She had done something she still hadn't told anyone. After he went upstairs. After she heard the guest room door close. After she had stood in the kitchen for a while, in the way you stand in rooms where something has just ended, not moving, just staying in the last moment of before. She had gone to the cabinet above the refrigerator and taken out the bottle of bourbon that Douglas kept for guests and poured 2 fingers into a glass and then stood at the kitchen counter and not drunk it. Just held it. For almost 20 minutes, just held it and looked out the window at the dark backyard where Faye's old playset still stood, the one they'd had delivered on her 5th birthday. The slides slightly warped now, the swings never replaced after one of the chains broke. Then she had put the glass in the sink without drinking it and washed it and gone to bed. She thought about that now for some reason driving. The not drinking. Because it would have been easy. Because no one would have known. Because she had wanted to and had found some small, intact version of herself that said not now and listened to it. That version of herself. She'd been trying to find it ever since. The drive to Briarlock Road took 19 minutes. She had pulled up the address on her phone. The GPS took her through the center of Caldwell past the coffee shop where Faye worked. Past the school where Colt had his locker with the bent door that only opened if you hit it on the right corner. Past the empty lot where the community center used to be before Harlan Voss bought it and turned it into a parking structure, past the old lumber mill building that someone had started renovating 3 years ago, and then stopped and left with half a new roof and scaffolding that was slowly rusting in place. Then across the railroad tracks. Then into the part of Caldwell that the development money had never reached and had apparently never intended to. Briarlock Road was a narrow 2-lane that ran through old-growth trees, white pines mostly, and maples that had already lost their leaves, their branches bare and dark against a sky the color of pewter. The road surface was cracked and patched and cracked again. The few houses she passed sat back from the road on large lots, some occupied, some not clearly either way. Then the driveway, unpaved. 2 shallow ruts through weeds that had gone to seed and then been flattened by the first frost, and then dusted with the first light snowfall, and then forgotten about by everything except the cold. Marin turned in and stopped the car, and sat. The house was worse than she had imagined, not in a single dramatic way, in dozens of small simultaneous ways that added up to something that looked less like a building and more like the idea of a building in the process of returning to the materials it had come from. It had been a Victorian once. You could see it if you looked for it. The roofline had ambition. The windows had been tall, designed to pull in light, the kind of architectural optimism that spoke of a builder who believed in mornings and what they could look like from inside. There was a wraparound porch, or there had been. Now it leaned forward at an angle that suggested the foundation had made a unilateral decision years ago, and the porch had simply gone along with it. The roof sagged at the center. Half the windows were gone, just openings, dark rectangles in a facade that had gone from white to gray to something that wasn't quite a color anymore. The siding coming away from the frame in long curling strips that moved slightly in the wind. The eastern wall had been entirely claimed by vines that had gone in through the windows and were working their way up through the interior and back out through the roof, in places the house slowly being digested by the hillside it sat on. In the failing November light, it looked not like a place where people had lived, but like a place where living had been attempted and then gently, firmly declined. From the back seat, Colt spoke. "Mom, we can't live here." Not dramatics, just observation. The flat statement of a 14-year-old who had developed in the last 8 months a preference for naming things as they were. Marin gripped the wheel. She felt it then. The full, unpadded weight of what she had done. The last $15. The condemned deed in her bag. The iron key she didn't understand. The building in front of her that looked like it would fold in on itself if someone raised their voice inside it. And 2 children behind her who had already lost too much and were now watching her through the rearview mirror. A truck slowed on the road behind them. A voice called through the open window, too loud, too cheerful. The voice of someone who had been waiting for the punchline. "Nice place, Marin. Heard you got a real bargain." Laughter. Engine accelerating. Gone. Marin wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. One fast motion, like something being corrected. She opened her car door. "Out. Both of you. Grab everything we brought. We're going in." "Mom." Faye's voice. "Careful. Mom, people are saying online that the roof could actually collapse, that someone went in there last year and the floor went through in 2 places. That Faye." "What?" "We are being evicted in 2 days. That house, whatever it is, belongs to us. No landlord, no judge. No one can take us out of something we own. So we are going to go inside, find the safest room in there, and we are going to sleep in it tonight. Tomorrow, we figure out the next thing. But tonight, we sleep under our own roof." Faye looked at her. Something moved across her daughter's face that Marin hadn't seen in a very long time. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. Something quieter and more provisional than hope. The small, careful recognition that her mother was still here, still making decisions, still pushing through walls instead of around them. Faye got out of the car. Colt was already standing in the driveway with his arms full of garbage bags. They went in. The front door was warped in its frame, swollen from decades of Michigan wet, and freeze the modern lock long rusted through. Marin put her shoulder against it and pushed, and it opened with the prolonged groan of something that had not been asked to do this in a very long time. The smell came first. Mold, yes. Rot, yes. But underneath those, something older. The smell of air that has been enclosed so long, it has become a kind of record of every season that has passed through the broken windows, of every winter that has settled into the walls. She swept her phone's flashlight across the entry hall. The floor was wide plank oak, buried under decades of grime, but solid when she tested it with her weight. To the left, a parlor with a collapsed bookcase and a fireplace someone had partially bricked over. To the right, a dining room with wallpaper peeling in long, humid strips and a window that was just a hole in the wall letting in cold air. Straight ahead, a staircase. She looked at it. The banister was gone. 2 of the visible treads had soft spots in the centers. "We don't use the stairs," she said. "Not yet. Stay on the ground floor." They moved through the house slowly, room by room. The kitchen was the worst. The ceiling had partially collapsed over the sink, leaving a ragged opening that showed gray sky. The cabinets hung at angles. Something had been living behind the dishwasher at some point and had left evidence of this in a way that Marin assessed quickly and decided not to narrate. But off the back of the kitchen, there was a door. Small, low-ceilinged, a room that had probably been a pantry when the house was built, or servants' quarters back when houses like this had those. The floor, when Marin stepped on it, was solid. Hardwood dirty, but not compromised. The walls were plaster over brick dry intact. The door closed properly, and its latch held. "Here," she said. "This is where we stay." They cleaned it the way you clean when cleaning is the only action available to you. With rags from the car and water from the bottles they'd brought, and a broom Colt found leaning against the hallway wall and carried in with the manner of someone who has been waiting for something useful to do. Marin had 1 candle in the bag she'd packed, a votive in a small glass jar left over from the apartment from the time when she had bought candles for atmosphere rather than necessity. She set it in the center of the room and lit it. The light was small, but it was warm, and it pushed the dark to the corners. And in that light, the 3 of them became something that reminded Marin illogically of those old paintings. Mother and children in a circle of candlelight. The kind of painting people hang in museums and describe as intimate. The kind that survives because it captures something real about what it means to be people together in the dark. Faye spoke first. Her voice was different now, quieter. The edge gone out of it for the first time in months. What are we actually going to do, Mom? Marin reached into her coat pocket. She took out the iron skeleton key and turned it in the candlelight. The metal caught the flame and held it. I don't know all of it yet, but this house is 130 years old, and it's still standing. She paused. So are we. Faye looked at the key for a long moment. Then she lay down on the blanket she'd unrolled on the floor, turned toward the wall, and after a while, her breathing slowed. Colt was already asleep, curled on his side shoes, still on hands tucked under his chin, and he looked younger than 14 in the candlelight, or maybe just more honest, the way sleeping people sometimes look like earlier versions of themselves. Marin sat with her back against the wall. She held the key. She listened to the house breathe around her. Wind in the empty windows. The creak of old joists settling into the cold. Small sounds behind the plaster. A squirrel or mice that had been here long before Marin arrived and had no particular opinion about her presence. It was not silence. It was something older than silence. The sound of a structure that had been given up on by everyone and had kept going anyway. Not because of will. Buildings don't have will. Because the person who built it had used the right materials. Because the bones were good, even when everything visible was falling apart. She thought about the key. For the owner, the envelope had said, 31 years. Agnes Holbrook had kept it in the bottom drawer of her desk, waiting for someone to come and sign a deed in person. 31 years it had sat in that yellowing envelope. Before that, longer. The house had been vacant since 1986. Before that, it had been abandoned in some less official way. And before that, it had been lived in by someone who had thought this key was important enough to leave behind. She did not know what it opened. She did not know what waited in this house beyond rot and cold, and the things that had moved in when the people moved out. But she had made a choice today. Not a good choice, possibly. Not a safe one, certainly. But a choice that was entirely hers. Made in the full knowledge of her situation, with her eyes open, without anyone telling her what to do, or signing on her behalf, or translating the world for her through their version of it. For the first time in 18 years, she had decided something, on her own, for herself and her children, without permission. The candle burned low. The shadows on the wall shifted and softened. Outside, through the gap, where a window had been, she could see a patch of sky beginning to release the first snow of the season. Light and quiet, the kind that falls sideways in the early dark, covering the overgrown yard and the leaning porch, and the 2 tire ruts in the driveway, in a thin white layer that made everything look for a moment like it might be starting over. Marin closed her hand around the iron key and waited for morning. The first week was a lesson in what survival actually looks like. Not the version from movies. Not the version where someone resourceful and slightly dirty makes clever traps in the wilderness and emerges stronger and tan. The real version, which is smaller and colder, and involves a lot of standing in front of open cupboards that have nothing in them making calculations about what a person actually needs versus what they have assumed they need, and finding the gap between those two things wider than expected. No electricity. The power had been disconnected in 1986, and the lines leading to the house had been removed sometime after that, the utility company apparently deciding the structure wasn't worth maintaining the connection to. No running water. The pipes had frozen and burst at some point in the intervening decades, and even if they hadn't, there was nothing to push water through them. No heat except what their bodies made, and what the walls, when they were honest about it, barely contained. November nights in northern Michigan went below freezing before 10 o'clock. Maren woke each morning with stiff fingers. She lay still for a moment before opening her eyes. A habit she had developed in the apartment after the divorce, that liminal minute before the day arrived, where it was possible to exist without accounting for it. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the cracked plaster ceiling of the pantry room and accounted for it. She established a routine, because routine was the only architecture she could build with what she had. Mornings drive to the gas station 2 miles up Briarlock Road to fill the water jugs they'd found in the shed. Charge their phones in the outlet by the air pump, while the attendant, a man in his 50s named Gene, who had stopped asking questions after the 3rd day, pretended not to watch. Midday clean. Not because the cleaning made the house livable, not yet, but because filth was an enemy she could fight with her hands, and fighting kept her warm, and warm kept her sane, and sane kept the children from seeing what was underneath. Evenings, eat whatever they had heated on the camping stove Faye had bought with 2 weeks of tip money without being asked, and plan. Maren kept a notebook. She had found it in her bag, a spiral bound from the dollar store she'd bought in September for some purpose she no longer remembered. She wrote lists by flashlight. Things that need fixing everything. Things that can wait nothing. Things we can do ourselves unknown. The lists got longer every day, but the act of writing them, the act of sitting with a pen and making the impossible visible on paper, that did something. Not to the problems. The problems didn't care about being listed. But to Maren, it gave her the sensation, however provisional, that she was inside the situation rather than underneath it. Colt found tools in the overgrown yard. A hammer with a cracked handle, a crowbar, a rusted handsaw, a level with a bubble that still moved correctly, which seemed almost miraculous given everything else. He carried them inside one at a time, like artifacts, cleaned them with an oily rag he'd found in the shed, with the same methodical care he applied to everything. Then laid them out on the floor of the pantry room in a row, handles aligned. He didn't say why. He just did it. And Maren looked at the tools laid out on the floor and understood that her 14-year-old son was getting ready to work. That he had looked at the situation and decided that waiting for rescue was not his preference. Faye helped differently. She did not pick up tools. She boarded windows, scrap wood from the collapsed shed in the backyard. Nails she straightened from the original boards because they didn't have money for new ones, a hammer she borrowed from Colt's row. The boards were crooked and the fit wasn't perfect, but they blocked the wind. And blocking the wind was, in the first week of November in northern Michigan, an act of genuine mercy. She did this without comment, without asking for acknowledgement, without once saying what they both knew, which was that she was angry. Not at Maren, not exactly, at the situation, at the way things had gone, at the specific injustice of being 17 and capable and furious, and also, underneath all of that, more loyal than she had ever been given credit for. The mockery did not stop. A truck slowed on Briarlock Road 2 or 3 times in that first week. Voices calling in, comments designed to carry. Someone had created a social media page. Maren's Mansion, it was called. It had 70 followers by Wednesday, 300 by Friday. People from Caldwell posting photographs they had taken from the road, jokes about property values, bets on how long she would last before giving up. Douglas was tagged in every post. He never asked them to stop. Faye saw it on Thursday. She came to Maren in the kitchen, or what passed for a kitchen, which was a cleared section of floor near the camping stove, and the water jugs, and held up her phone. 300 people, Mom. I know. Dad's not saying anything to them. I know. Faye looked at the phone for another moment. Then she put it in her pocket. She picked up the hammer. She went back to the windows. And Marin stood in the cleared section of kitchen floor and breathed. Just breathed. Because the alternative was a feeling she could not afford to have right now in front of her children. The specific grief of watching a person you once loved become the kind of person who lets a crowd mock the mother of his children and does not intervene. Not because he's busy, because he doesn't want to. She went back to cleaning. She started in the pantry room and worked outward, scrubbing floors with water hauled from the jugs and dish soap from the dollar store on her hands and knees, moving across each room in sections. The grime came up slowly, reluctantly. Decades of it. But underneath, consistently and almost defiantly, there was wood. Good wood. Wide plank oak, the color of honey, still beautiful under 40 years of neglect. Grain that caught the light from her flashlight and held it. Someone had built this house to be beautiful. That was the thing she kept returning to in the evenings when the children were asleep, and she sat with the notebook and the flashlight and the sound of wind through the boards Faye had nailed crookedly but firmly into place. Someone had built this house with care, with intention, with the kind of attention to material and craft that meant they believed it would last. And it had. Beneath everything that time and neglect and the elements had done to the surface, the bones were what Silas Pruitt had said they were. Good. She had not met Silas Pruitt yet. That happened on the 8th day. She was coming back from the gas station, the back seat full of water jugs and a bag of groceries from the store adjacent, and when she turned into the driveway, she saw the truck. Old, blue, the color of a faded sky. A lumber rack on the back holding a few lengths of 2x4 and a metal toolbox secured with bungee cords. Parked not in the driveway, but at the edge of the road. Careful not to trespass. Deliberate about the distinction. A man stood at the property line, tall, slightly stooped at the shoulders in the way of very tall people who have spent a lifetime in rooms built for average. His hands were the first thing she noticed, too large for the rest of him. The hands of someone who had spent decades gripping things, building things, taking things apart and reassembling them. He wore a canvas work jacket the color of dead leaves and a cap with no logo, which in a world of branded caps felt like a statement. He was looking at the house the way a doctor looks at a patient, systematically, without sentiment, cataloging damage and possibility in equal measure. Marin got out of the car. He turned toward her without hurry. "You're the one who bought it." Not a question, a verification of something he had already decided. "I am. Silas Pruitt. I live at the end of the road. Last house before the tree line. Been there 41 years. She waited. For the punchline. For the condescension. For the version of this conversation she had been having for 2 weeks, where someone established their connection to the situation and then delivered their verdict on her judgment. It didn't come. Silas looked back at the house. His eyes moved along the roofline, down the siding, to the porch, which he did not step onto, but crouched beside to look at the underside at the joists and the support posts and the foundation where it met the earth. "My grandfather used to talk about this house," he said. "Said it was built by a man from back east who got cheated out of everything he owned. Said the man buried something here before he died." He stood. "My grandfather was a carpenter. Taught my father. My father taught me. He brushed dirt from his knees. I retired from the trade 8 years ago when my wife passed, and my hands started telling me what they could and couldn't do anymore. But they remember more than they've forgotten." He walked a few steps along the porch edge, stopped, crouched again. "Your porch is beyond saving this season, but these posts can be shored up enough to hold the roof through winter. Foundations shifted on the north side. That's your priority after the roof. The framing is white oak throughout." She paused. He straightened. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. White oak doesn't rot the way softer wood does. It resists. That's why it's still standing. He looked at Marin. I'm not offering to fix your house. I'm 74. That's too much for one man, even if he were 40. But I can show you what matters and what can wait. And your boy. He nodded toward the house. Toward the window where Colt had appeared without Marin noticing, watching the stranger in the yard, with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for exactly this. He's got the hands for it. I can see it from here. Marin felt something shift in her chest. Not hope. She was still too cautious for hope. Something quieter. The recognition that she was possibly not as alone as the last 8 months had led her to believe. Why, she said, "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Silas considered this for a while. He seemed to genuinely think about it rather than reaching for a prepared answer. My wife was sick for 3 years before she died. Long illness. The kind where you watch someone leave slowly and there's nothing you can do but be present for it. Toward the end, I couldn't do anything for her except sit in the chair by her bed and hold her hand. After she passed, I sat in that same chair for a long time because I didn't know what to do with my hands. He looked at the house again. Building something, even something that isn't yours. That's not charity. That's medicine. He walked back to his truck, opened the toolbox, removed a level of framing square and a tape measure, held them up without ceremony. Tomorrow morning, 6:45, I'll bring lumber for the porch posts and the north foundation jacks. You supply coffee. He nodded toward the window where Colt still stood. And the boy. He drove away without waiting for an answer. Silas arrived the next morning at 6:42. Marin had the coffee ready, brewed on the camping stove in a pot she'd found at the Goodwill on Route 9, a dented aluminum percolator that made coffee that tasted like it meant business. Silas drank it without commenting on the quality, which was the kindest thing he could have done. Then he took Colt through the house for an hour, not explaining, showing, pointing. This beam carries load. That wall is finish only. See how the floor tilts here toward the north corner? That tells you where the foundation is losing the argument with gravity. We fix that first, or nothing else we do will matter. Colt listened the way she had not seen him listen to anything in a very long time. Completely. Without the low-level fidget that had become his default. Without checking his phone. Without the glazed compliance of a teenager attending to an adult out of obligation. He was interested, not politely interested, actually interested. The kind of interested that comes from finding without expecting to a thing that fits. He asked questions. Why white oak instead of pine for the framing? How you tell if a joist is failing before you tear up the floor? What's the difference between cosmetic damage and structural damage? And how do you know which you're looking at when they can look the same from the outside? Silas answered each one, fully, without the faint impatience of an adult who considers a child's curiosity an interruption. He answered like a man who had been waiting for someone to ask, who had accumulated over 50 years of working with his hands a body of knowledge that had nowhere to go since his wife passed, and his apprentice moved to Grand Rapids, and the trade became something he was retired from. They started on the porch, not rebuilding it. They didn't have materials for that. Stabilizing it, installing temporary posts at the load-bearing corners, shoring the center beam, ensuring that the roof above the porch stayed connected to the building beneath it through the coming winter. Silas had brought scrap lumber from his own garage. Wood saved from jobs over the decades, organized by species and dimension along one wall of his workshop, because a good carpenter never throws away good wood, and the day always comes when you need exactly the piece you almost got rid of. Colt hammered. He was bad at first. Bent nails, split the edge of a board, hit his left thumb on the second day, and went very still for a moment, and then shook his hand twice and picked up the hammer again. Didn't say anything. Didn't stop. By the third day, his swing was more consistent. By the fifth, Silas stopped correcting his grip. Faye watched from inside. Through the window, she'd boarded herself through the gap at the corner she'd left, because the nail wasn't quite long enough to close it. She watched her brother work beside the old man, and she did not join them. But Marin noticed that she had moved her operations. She was now working in the dining room, sorting. She had found somewhere a set of colored markers, and she was doing something with Crawford's documents. Wait. Marin stopped in the hallway outside the dining room. She hadn't told Faye about Crawford yet. She went in. Faye had the documents spread across the floor in the center of the room, organized in rows that Marin did not immediately understand. Color-coded tabs she had made from Post-it notes cut into strips. A handwritten timeline on the back of a grocery bag running left to right across the floor. "What are you doing?" "AP History," Faye said without looking up. "I'm cross-referencing the dates in the journal with the dates on the legal documents. There are discrepancies in the sequence that might matter." She looked up. "Did you know the state land deed is dated 3 years before any of the local records? That means it has prior claim." She looked back down at the floor. Whatever they tried to do to him locally, it was built on top of something they couldn't actually erase. Because they didn't file at the local level. He filed at the state level. On purpose. Marin stood in the doorway looking at her 17-year-old daughter, sitting in the middle of a ruined dining room floor building a legal case with Post-it notes and colored markers. "Faye," she said. "What?" "Nothing. Just..." "Thank you." Faye looked up again. Something moved across her face. Not softness exactly. A small suspension of the armor. "I'm not doing it for you," she said. "I'm doing it because someone has to, and you're busy not falling off a ladder." Which was the most loving thing her daughter had said to her in 8 months. Marin let it stand. She went back to work. Wendell Farr filed the quiet title claim on a Thursday afternoon in late November. He called Marin as she was on her knees in the upstairs hallway, which she had finally decided was structurally sound enough to access if you stayed to the right side and moved slowly. "It's filed. State Circuit Court as of 3:15 this afternoon. The claim is on public record." She sat back on her heels. "What happens now?" Wendell was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not uncertainty, but preparation. Now it gets loud. He was not wrong. By 9 the next morning, it was on the local news. Woman claims condemned house purchase entitles her to 320 acres of downtown Caldwell. By noon, it had reached the Detroit papers. By evening, it was on 3 national news sites, and 2 morning show producers had called Wendell's office asking about interviews. Marin turned her phone off. She turned it on twice to check on the children's schedules, and turned it off again each time. The missed call count each time she turned it on was in the dozens. She stopped looking at the number. Douglas posted within 4 hours of the story breaking. She knew this because Faye told her face, neutral voice, carefully uninflected. "He says you've lost your mind. He says he feels sorry for us." He didn't call. He posted 200 me's on a stranger's comment thread about what it felt like to watch someone self-destruct in public. He didn't call his children. He didn't call Marin. He posted. Harlan Voss came 4 days after the filing. Marin was on the porch with Silas when the SUV turned into the driveway. Black, recent model year. Moving at a speed that communicated that the driver was accustomed to driveways that were better maintained than this one, and was choosing to accommodate it rather than be stopped by it. Voss sat behind the tinted glass for a full minute before getting out. Marin had been warned about Harlan Voss. Not in those words, not by anyone who put it that directly, but Caldwell was a small town, and Douglas had been in development here for years, and she had absorbed through proximity the shape of the local power structure. Voss owned the shopping center. He owned half the commercial lots on Main Street. He had bought the community center 3 years ago and turned it into a parking structure which nobody wanted, and then won a city contract to manage said parking structure, which was the kind of move that required either a great lawyer or a city councilman in your pocket, and Voss had both. He was 59, gray at the temples, wearing a coat that cost more than Marin's monthly apartment rent had been. He came up the path without looking at the house. Looking at Marin. "Mrs. Ashby." "Ms.," she said. A small sound. Acknowledgement without agreement. He held out his hand, and she shook it because she had been raised to. "I wanted to have a conversation before this becomes more complicated than it needs to be. It's already complicated." "It doesn't have to be." He glanced at Silas, who had not moved from his position at the corner of the porch level in handworking. Then back to Marin. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 for a clean transfer of the property and withdrawal of the claim. Today. You walk away. You take care of your children. You start over somewhere that doesn't require you to winter in a condemned building." Marin let him finish. She let the silence after his last word expand. A full 8 seconds of it. Long enough for him to shift his weight. "The land under your shopping center alone is worth more than $12 million at current market rate," she said. "Wendell Farr has confirmed this. So no, Mr. Voss. 500,000 isn't a serious offer. It's an opening position designed to see if I understand what I'm holding." His face changed. Not dramatically. A small rearrangement. The easy surface confidence withdrawing to reveal something older and harder underneath. "You're making a mistake you don't have the resources to sustain. I'm living in a condemned building with no heat and 2 teenagers. My resource base is already at the floor, Mr. Voss. There is no lower I can be pushed to." She reached into her coat pocket, took out the iron key on its cord. Held it up not as a threat, as a fact. "The way you hold a document when you want someone to see that you have it. Don't come back to this property without an invitation." His tires threw gravel against the porch steps when he left. Silas watched the SUV disappear down Briarlock Road. He drank his coffee. "Well," he said. "Yeah," Marin said. They went back to work. The demolition order arrived on day 17. Not by mail. Hand-delivered by a county code enforcement officer named Martin Welch, who looked approximately as comfortable as a person can look while handing someone a legal notice that will ruin their day, which is to say, not very. City of Caldwell, emergency order. Condemned structure at 1247 Briarlock Road. The owner has 30 days to bring the structure into compliance with minimum habitability standards. Failure to comply will result in forced demolition at the owner's expense. Marin read it twice. 30 days. She called Wendell from the gas station because the reception was better there. "It's legal," he said. "The house genuinely doesn't meet code." Voss didn't even have to push hard. The council had the authority and the justification. He paused. "Your only path forward is compliance. 30 days. Minimum habitability standards," she said. "Roof integrity, foundation stability, electrical to code, plumbing functional, structural safety throughout. Those are the basics. A lot of basics." "Okay. Marin, you don't have the money for contractors. You don't have—" "I understand what I don't have. What's the minimum? What's the actual floor?" Wendell was quiet for a moment. "You need to pass a safety inspection by a county code officer. That officer needs to be able to walk through the building and determine it's not an imminent danger to its occupants. That's the legal standard. Minimum safe habitation. Not livable by most definitions. Safe enough that the demolition order becomes unenforceable. 30 days, she said again. 29 now." She drove back to the house. That night, after Faye and Colt were asleep, she sat on the porch in the cold. She had the $15 bill in her coat pocket still. She had started carrying it the way she used to carry a worry stone, something to touch, when her hands needed to be doing something that her mind didn't have instructions for yet. She thought about what 30 days meant. Roof, foundation, electrical, plumbing, structural safety. She was one woman who had spent the last 18 years running a household and not building one. She had a 74-year-old retired carpenter who came in the mornings because it was medicine, and a 14-year-old who was learning. She had no money for materials beyond what she could find or salvage. She had 29 days. She took out the notebook. She made a list, not of problems, of people. Walt came the next morning without being called, which meant the demolition order had moved through Caldwell at the speed that information moves through small towns, which is faster than most people want it to, and slower than the person waiting for it always hopes. He stood in the kitchen looking at her list. Roof, foundation, electrical, plumbing, windows, interior structural, stairs. He pulled out his phone, an old flip phone, the kind that made calls and stored numbers and did nothing else, which suited him. He dialed, then again, then a third time. Marin listened to his side of the conversations. They were very short. He stated the address, the timeline, the scope of the work. He stated clearly that the homeowner had no money. Then he said, "If you can help, come. If you can't, I understand." Each call ended the same way. By noon, 3 vehicles were in the driveway. Alvin Steed was 66, retired plumber, had fixed pipes in Caldwell for 34 years, and still kept his tools organized the way he had when he was working everything in its place labeled ready. Dorothy Marsh was 59, had painted houses for a living, still kept her brushes in pristine condition out of habit and pride. Curtis Reed was 38, ran maintenance at the elementary school, knew electrical systems because the school's wiring was installed in the 1960s and had required creative interpretation ever since. They did not come in with speeches. They walked through the house the way tradespeople walk through houses. Methodically, making notes, looking at what was there rather than what they had expected. Then they began. By the following day, there were 4 more, then 2 more the day after. They were not organized. There was no coordinator, no volunteer registration, no T-shirts. People came because Silas had called, or because someone Silas called had called someone else, or because they had driven past on Briarlock Road on their way to somewhere else and seen people working and stopped to ask what was happening, and then for reasons they might or might not have been able to articulate stayed. They were mostly retired. Mostly people whose working lives had been built around making things with their hands, and who found themselves in retirement with skills that had accumulated over decades and no particular place to put them. Not all of them admired Marin. Some had laughed at the auction story. Some had shared the social media posts. Some had frankly thought she was deranged when they heard what she'd done with $15. But they were not there for Marin. Not entirely. They were there because Harlan Voss had raised the rents on 3 Main Street storefronts last year, and 2 small businesses had closed as a result. Because Voss had bought the community center and turned it into a parking structure nobody needed, and charged the city to manage it. Because Voss had blocked the public footpath to the lake so his development company could build condominiums on the shoreline. The people of Caldwell had watched their town reshaped around the preferences of one wealthy man and had not known what to do about it. Now they knew. They could fix a roof. Marin was in every room every day. She learned to measure and cut lumber from Silas. She learned to solder a pipe joint from Alvin, the first attempt leaking the second holding. She sanded floors on her hands and knees until her palms blistered, and the blisters broke, and she wrapped them in athletic tape from the first aid kit and kept sanding. The floors were extraordinary. Underneath the grime and the rotted carpet, underneath the decades of accumulated damage, the oak was honey-colored and tight-grained, and so well seasoned by time that the sanding brought it up to a finish that required almost nothing else. Beautiful. Still beautiful after all of it. Colt was on the roof by the second week, under Silas's direction, never alone, but on the roof. Learning to assess damage. Learning to nail sheathing without splitting it. Learning the difference between a rafter that needed sistering and one that needed replacing. He came inside each evening with sawdust in his hair and a kind of satisfaction in his face that Maren had not seen there in a long time, possibly ever. The satisfaction of a body that has been used correctly. Faye had finished the document timeline. She brought it to Wendell's office, and Wendell had spent 20 minutes with it and come back to Maren with something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not guilt for once. Something more forward-looking. He called it meticulous. He said it was more organized than most of what his paralegal produced. Faye had said without looking up from the floor she was currently scrubbing, "Tell him I want extra credit, day 22. The storm came from the northwest, the way Michigan storms do in December. Not building, arriving, all at once, like a door opening in the sky. Wind first, then snow thick and horizontal driven by gusts the Weather Service would later measure at 60 miles an hour. The old oaks along Briarlock Road groaned in their roots. Then the sound, a crack from the north side of the roof that Maren felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. A section of the newly laid sheathing, 40 feet of it, peeled back under a sustained gust and tore loose at the nails. The membrane beneath it went with it. Water came through immediately. Not a drip. A pour. It hit the parlor floor and spread, moving across the oak boards she had sanded by hand, pooling against the baseboards, reaching in rivulets toward the dining room. Toward the trap door. Maren stood in the middle of the parlor. Water ran down the walls. Wind screamed through the gap in the roof. Her flashlight showed a room that was in that moment indistinguishable from the room she had walked into on the first night. All the work. All of it. The sanded floors, the cleaned walls, the windows Faye had boarded, the structural work Silas and Colt had done, the roof itself that they had spent 6 days sheathing in the cold. Gone. Or enough of it gone. She reached into her pocket. The $15 bill was there, damp now, soft as cloth. She stood in the light of her flashlight in the middle of a room, with water coming through the ceiling and wind coming through the walls and 8 days left on a demolition order and no money and no contractor and no backup plan that she hadn't already exhausted. And she felt it. The thing she had been keeping below the surface for 22 days. Not fear. Fear she could work with. Fear she had been working with every day. This was different. This was the impulse to stop, to fold the $15 back into her pocket and walk to the car and drive in any direction and let the house collapse behind her and the claim expire and the whole impossible enterprise end, exactly the way everyone at the auction had predicted it would. With her recognizing finally that they had been right, that it had been insane, that there was no version of this where a woman with $15 beats a man with everything. She sat down on the wet floor. She put her head in her hands. The water soaked through her jeans. She sat. Colt found her. He came down the hall from the backroom shoes, untied, face tight, with the specific worry of a child who has heard something and come to assess. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the water and the torn ceiling and his mother on the floor. He sat down next to her. The water soaked through his jeans, too. He didn't react to it. He just sat there in the wet and the dark, close enough that his shoulder was against hers. Faye came 30 seconds later. She had the blanket from their room. She wrapped it around Maren's shoulders without saying anything. Then she sat down on Maren's other side. 3 people, on a wet floor, in a broken house, in the middle of a storm that did not care about any of them. Not speaking, not moving, just together in the wreckage of something they had been trying to build. The storm went until 4 in the morning. When it stopped, the silence was so complete it seemed to have a texture. At 6:45, Maren heard tires on the driveway. She went to the window. Silas's truck. Behind it, Alvin's van. Behind that, Dorothy's station wagon. Then Curtis in his school district pickup. Then 2 more vehicles she didn't immediately recognize. 8 people walked up the drive in the early gray light, each carrying something. Lumber. Tarps. A generator Curtis had borrowed from the school's maintenance shed without filling out the paperwork. Silas walked up to the porch. He looked at the torn roof. He looked at Maren standing in the doorway. Eyes red clothes, still damp from the night, the blanket from Faye still around her shoulders. "I've seen worse," he said. January of '89, a storm took the north face off the Methodist Church on Elm Street. We had it closed in 4 days and resheathed by Sunday. This is one section. He turned to the others. Alvin, water damage interior. Curtis generator and light setup so we can see what we're doing. Dorothy checked the paint on the exterior south face that took the wind. Let's go. They went. Maren stood on the porch and watched them move through her yard with their tools and their lumber and their aging knees and their decades of accumulated knowledge about how to fix things that were broken. And she understood something she had not understood before. She had thought this was her house to save. Hers alone. Her responsibility. Her failure if it fell and her victory if it stood. But these people, they had poured their labor into this house. Their mornings, their expertise, their aching backs, and their careful hands, and their particular knowledge of joists and pipe fittings and load-bearing walls. And the thing you pour yourself into the thing you build with your body and your time and your skill becomes yours in some real and irreducible way. This was not her house anymore. Not entirely. It was theirs. The thing they had built together from nothing. The thing that carried their work in its walls. And they had not come back this morning to save Maren. They had come back to save what they had made. Day 29. The inspector arrived at 9 in the morning. His name was Glenn Murchison, county employee, clipboard. The demeanor of a man who had been doing this job long enough to have strong opinions about people who wasted his time and who had already formed a preliminary opinion about this particular property before he got out of his car. He walked through the house slowly. He checked everything: the roof, the foundation, the electrical panel Curtis had brought up to minimum standard working 14-hour days for the last week. The plumbing Alvin had connected to the well on the property, the one nobody had known existed, until Curtis found the capped pipe buried under 3 feet of soil near the base of the oak tree. The stairs that Silas and Colt had rebuilt from scratch using white oak salvaged from the collapsed barn section at the back of the property, each tread mortised and pegged the old way because Silas said, if you're going to do it, you do it right. The windows, the walls, the structural integrity of the first and second floor. Maren followed him through every room. She answered his questions in complete sentences. She showed him receipts for materials, printouts of the work permits Wendell had expedited through a contact at the county office, photographs documenting the progression from condemned ruin to whatever this was now, which was not finished, but was something, which was the point. Murchison wrote things on his clipboard, a lot of things. Maren could not read his handwriting from where she stood, and she did not try. The inspection took 85 minutes. At the end of it, Murchison stood on the porch that Silas and Colt had stabilized in the first week, and then when the materials became available from donations properly rebuilt. The boards were level. The posts were plumb. The railing held weight without shifting. He looked at his clipboard for a long time. The structure meets minimum safety and habitability standards. He did not look up when he said it. Barely. There are 19 items requiring attention within 6 months for full code compliance. He listed them. He listed all 19. Marin wrote them in her notebook without expression. But as of this inspection, the demolition order is not enforceable. He signed the form. He handed her a copy. He walked to his car without looking back. Marin stood on the porch with the signed form in both hands. From inside the house, she heard Colt make a sound. Not a word, not a cheer, just a long, slow release of breath. The sound of a 14-year-old boy who had been holding something in his chest for 30 days and had just been given permission to put it down. Faye appeared in the doorway. She looked at the form, then at her mother. "We passed." Marin nodded. Her throat was doing something that made words complicated. Faye's chin trembled. Once. Then she pressed her lips together and went back inside quickly the way she did when she didn't want to be seen crying, which was something she had gotten from Marin, and Marin was not sure whether to feel proud or sorry about that. Marin called Wendell. Demolition order lifted. "We passed." His exhale was audible from 2 miles away. Then he said, "The hearing is scheduled for the 3rd Friday in February. Judge Edna Holcomb, Voss's consortium, filed a motion to dismiss last week. I've responded. She'll hear arguments and decide whether the claim proceeds to trial." "Are we going to win?" Wendell was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a lawyer choosing precision over reassurance. "Our case is strong. The documentation is legitimate. The legal framework is sound. But Marin, Voss is not going to rely on lawyers alone. He will look for other ways to undermine you. Be ready for something unexpected." Something unexpected arrived 2 days later. Douglas called. She didn't answer. He called again. She didn't answer. He texted, "We need to talk about the property claim. It's important for the kids." She put her phone face down on the kitchen counter and went back to sanding the 2nd-floor hallway. The next morning, Wendell called, and his voice had the particular quality of a man delivering news he would have preferred not to have. "Douglas filed a motion this morning." She stopped sanding. "He's arguing that the $3,000 from the divorce settlement which constitutes the funds you used to purchase the property retains its character as marital property. And therefore, any asset derived from those funds carries a co-ownership interest in his favor." He paused. "He's claiming partial ownership of the house, and through the house partial standing in the land claim." The hallway was very quiet. He partnered with Voss's legal team. They filed together. Marin set the sandpaper down on the floor beside her. She pressed both palms flat against the surface of the hallway wall. The plaster she had cleaned herself. The surface she had smoothed and sealed and painted with the 2nd coat of paint Dorothy had mixed to match the original color she had found under the baseboard trim. A warm cream, the color of morning light through old glass. Can he do this? Wendell exhaled. It's a reach. A significant reach. The law on commingled marital funds in post-settlement acquisitions is not clear-cut, and his argument requires the court to accept several premises that are individually challengeable. But the judge will have to consider it, and if he establishes even partial standing, Voss negotiates with him instead of you. Douglas takes whatever Voss offers, and you're left with the house and no claim to the land. Through the window at the end of the hallway, she could see the oak tree. The one Elias Crawford had planted in the yard sometime around 1891. Its trunk was wider than her arms could reach. Its branches bare now in December spread 40 feet in every direction, the lower ones thick enough to sit on the whole structure of it, so established and so rooted that it seemed less like a tree growing in a yard and more like a fixed point around which the yard had organized itself. 130 years. That tree had been there 130 years. It had watched the house built and occupied and abandoned. It had watched the land change hands through fraud. It had watched let decade after decade pass without anyone coming to claim what was buried 20 feet from its roots. And now the man who had taken 18 years of her life was trying to take the one thing she had found in the rubble. Her voice was very steady. He has never set foot in this house. I know. He did not hammer one nail. He did not sand one floor. He sat in his office in Caldwell and filed a motion claiming ownership of something he has never touched. I know. Find me something, Wendell. I'm looking. Find me something tonight. He called at 11:45. She was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with the original Crawford documents spread out in front of her. The candle she still preferred to the overhead light, casting a warm circle across the papers, the iron key on its cord around her neck, where she had started keeping it after the storm, because pockets could be emptied. But a thing worn close to the body stayed. I need the original trust document, he said. The physical document from the box. Not my copy. The original. She brought it to his office the next morning. Wendell spread it across his desk and read it with a magnifying glass. Not because the text was small, because he was looking for something specific. Something he had read before, but had not fully processed. Something that he was now reading with a different question in mind. He read it slowly. He turned pages. He stopped on page 3. He read the same passage twice, then a third time. Then he set the magnifying glass down and placed both hands flat on the desk, and Marin watched the tension leave his shoulders in a visible wave. Not all of it, but enough that she recognized the shape of what had just happened. He was smarter than either of us understood, Wendell said. He was quiet for a moment. Smarter than anyone who has ever tried to take this land in the last 130 years. He turned the document so she could read. The language was the formal, layered, grammatically complex prose of 19th century legal drafting. The kind of sentences that went on for half a page and subordinated every clause to every other clause in an architecture so deliberate it was almost beautiful. But the meaning was clear. The trust did not convey ownership to whoever held the deed to 1247 Briarlock Road. It conveyed ownership to whoever occupied and inhabited the property as their primary and continuous dwelling. The distinction was not accidental. Crawford had written it this way because he understood exactly how the people who had stolen his land operated. He had watched them use documents to take what other people built with their hands. He had seen it done to him, and so when he built his defense, he had built it against precisely that method. The inheritance belonged not to the person whose name appeared on paper. It belonged to the person who slept on the floors, who repaired the walls, who endured the winters, who was actually there. Douglas Ashby had never spent one night in 1247 Briarlock Road. He had not touched its walls or walked its floors or sat in the dark while a storm took off part of its roof. He had filed a legal motion from a warm office on the other side of Caldwell, claiming ownership of something he had never once had the courage to enter. And Elias Crawford, writing by candlelight in a cellar he had dug with his own hands in the winter of 1893, had already written the answer to that motion, 130 years before it was filed. Marin read the passage 4 times. On the 4th time, her vision blurred, and she understood that she was crying. Not from relief, not entirely, from something deeper and harder to name. The recognition that a man she had never met dead for over a century had understood something about the nature of injustice so precisely that his understanding had survived long enough to protect her. He had known. He had known that the people with power would always try to take things through paper, that they would use the language of ownership to claim things they had never actually inhabited, that they would never under any circumstances lower themselves to actually live in the thing they were trying to possess. and he had written his defense in the same language they used, but aimed it at their weakness, their unwillingness to be present, their contempt for the actual physical, unglamorous work of being somewhere. Wendell filed the response the next day. 4 pages. The trust clause quoted verbatim. A detailed chronology of Marin's occupancy, supported by photographs by the signed inspection report from Glenn Murchison, by affidavits from Silas and Alvin and Dorothy and Curtis confirming her continuous residence. Receipts for every material purchased: the camping stove, the water jugs, the dollar store soap. And at the end, 1 sentence. The respondent, Douglas Ashby, has never entered, occupied, repaired, improved, or spent a single night in the property at 1247 Briarlock Road, and therefore holds no claim under the Crawford Trust, which requires not ownership on paper, but presence in fact. Douglas's lawyers requested a 3-week extension to respond. The judge granted 1 week. The response, when it came, was procedural. Technical objections, requests for additional discovery, arguments about the definition of continuous habitation that required footnotes to footnotes. Wendell called Marin when he had read it. 2 words. They're drowning. February. Northern Michigan in February is the month that separates the people who chose to be there from the people who merely ended up there. The snow has been on the ground since November. The light is thin and arrives late, and leaves early and offers no particular warmth, even when it's present. The cold has moved into the bones of every building and every person, and settled in for a stay that won't end until April, and sometimes not until May. Marin woke on the morning of the hearing in the back room of the house, the room where she had slept that first night, the room with the candle in the jar and the 3 of them on the floor, and everything uncertain and everything in its way still possible. The room was warm now. Silas had brought a wood stove from his house the week after the storm. A cast-iron parlor stove, small, efficient, that had heated his living room for 2 decades. He had loaded it onto the truck himself and installed it himself, and stood back and looked at it, sitting in the corner of the room, and said nothing, which was how Silas expressed most things that mattered. Marin dressed in the clothes Faye had helped her choose from the Goodwill on Route 9. A charcoal blazer that fit well enough. Dark slacks with a pleat that held. Shoes that didn't have holes. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, the bathroom that now had running water and a working light, and a door that closed all the way. She did not recognize the woman in the mirror. Not in a bad way. Not in the way of estrangement. In the way of meeting someone you have heard about for a long time and finding that they are more substantial than the description. Not the woman who had been Mrs. Douglas Ashby. Managed, invisible, organized around another person's life so completely that when that person left, there was almost nothing with her own shape remaining. Not the woman on the bench in November with $15 and nowhere to go. Someone between those two. Someone who had been emptied out and was refilling with different material. Harder material. The kind that forms under pressure. Wendell met her at the courthouse steps. His arms were full of documents organized into labeled folders, which was the most organized Marin had ever seen him, and she had seen him in court twice before. His tie was slightly crooked. His hair was doing the thing it did when he'd been running his hand through it, which he did when he was nervous, which he was. She reached up and straightened his tie. He looked startled. "We're going to be fine," she said. And the thing was, she meant it. Not because she knew how it would go, not because certainty had returned to her in any reliable form, but because she had spent 3 months building something without certainty and had discovered that certainty wasn't what you actually needed. What you needed was the next thing to do. And she always knew the next thing to do. The courtroom was full. On one side, Voss's legal team. 5 attorneys in coordinated dark suits, a paralegal with a laptop. The kind of organization that communicated resources without needing to say the number. Voss himself in the second row. Composed. The expression of a man who had never lost anything he considered important and expected that record to continue. Douglas sat behind them. Separate from Voss. Not quite allied, but aligned. He wore the gray suit she recognized from the dinner parties she had organized, the one she had taken to the dry cleaner 3 times a year for 8 years without being asked. He did not look at her when she walked in. He was looking at his phone. Of course he was. Judge Edna Holcomb called the hearing to order. She was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and a voice that carried the authority of someone who had spent 30 years in courtrooms and developed a highly efficient system for distinguishing between people who were telling the truth and people who were performing it. She did not look like a woman who had time for performance. Voss's lead attorney was a man named Leland Cross. Marin had done some research. Cross had a reputation for being very good, which turned out to mean that he was measured and precise and knew when to push and when to let the silence work for him. And he used all of those skills now in a 70-minute argument that was genuinely impressive. He argued adverse possession. He argued abandonment. He argued the economic catastrophe that would result from upholding the claim. Hundreds of property owners, businesses, the tax base of an entire town. He did not waste a sentence. Then Wendell stood up. He was not Leland Cross. He did not have the polish, the tailoring, the institutional confidence of a man backed by a firm with 40 lawyers and a retainer that would make most people's eyes water. He had a cluttered desk and a flip phone and a case he had taken on contingency because a woman with no resources had spread a dead man's documents across his desk and asked him to believe her. But he had spent 3 months inside those documents. He knew every date, every signature, every clause. He knew the chain of recorded title from 1888 forward. He knew the specific legal mechanism of the trust and why Crawford had chosen it. He had Faye's binder, the color-coded cross-reference timeline that Faye had built in the dining room with post-it notes and markers, and which Judge Holcomb had been handed a copy of and had opened before Wendell finished his first sentence. He walked the judge through it, slowly, without rhetoric. Without the emotional appeals that lesser lawyers use when the facts don't carry them. He didn't need emotional appeals. He had facts. He had the state deed filed in Lansing in 1888, predating every local claim by 3 years. He had the trust mechanism filed in the state circuit court specifically to survive local interference. He had the survey maps matching current municipal boundaries within surveying tolerances. He had Marin's occupancy documented to a degree that Douglas's motion against her had no surface to grip. And then he read from the journal, Crawford's entry from March 1893. They will steal my land. They will build their town on my timber and my soil. They will believe they have prevailed. But the truth rests here beneath their feet waiting. I have placed it where proud men will never look. In a house they despise. In a cellar they do not know exists. Locked with a key they will never hold. Someday someone will come to this house. Not because it is valuable, but because they have nowhere else to go. And that person, that dismissed, underestimated soul, will find what I have left. And on that day, the descendants of thieves will answer for what their fathers stole. The courtroom was quiet in a way courtrooms almost never are. Not the quiet of waiting, the quiet of people who have just heard something true said out loud and need a moment to absorb it. Judge Holcomb was still. She looked at the document in front of her for a long time. Then she said, "This is an extraordinary case. The documentation is extensive, and as far as I can determine from the materials presented, authentic. The state deed is properly filed and recorded. The trust mechanism is legally sound. The occupancy requirement is clearly satisfied by the plaintiff. She paused. However, the practical implications of a full ruling are significant. I am taking this under advisement. Both parties will have my decision within 30 days. This hearing is adjourned. The room began to empty. Marin saw Voss stand and speak briefly with Cross. Cross nodded. Then Cross crossed the room to Wendell, and Wendell listened, and Voss watched from a distance with the expression of a man who has reassessed a situation and does not enjoy what the reassessment has shown him. Wendell came back to Marin. He wants to negotiate. Marin looked at Voss across the room. He had turned back to his team, squared his shoulders, doing what powerful men do when they have been forced into a corner and need a moment to recalibrate. Good, she said. Let him sit with it. Let him sit with it the way we have sat with it since November. Wendell almost smiled. That was day 1 of the 30 days. On day 4, a reporter from the regional paper published a story. Not about the hearing, about Douglas. The reporter had been in the courtroom. And what she had chosen to write about was not the intricacies of property law, or the historical documents, or the legal mechanism of the Crawford Trust. She had written about a man who had filed a motion claiming partial ownership of a condemned house he had never entered, occupied by the mother of his children, in order to partner with the man trying to demolish it. She had written it clearly, without editorializing. She hadn't needed to. The story ran online at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. By 9 that evening, it had been shared 14,000 times. Faye saw it at 6. She came to find Marin in the parlor where she was reading by the wood stove. She held up her phone without speaking. Marin read it. Then she set Faye's phone on the table next to her, and she felt something she had not expected. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Something quieter and less clean than either of those. The grief of watching a person reveal themselves fully. The grief of having your worst fears about someone confirmed publicly when part of you had always hoped to be wrong about them. Douglas called at 7:30. The first call in weeks. She let it ring. He called again at 8. She let it ring. At 8:20, he sent a text. Marin, I think we need to talk. I made a mistake. She read it. She thought about the 8 months, about the divorce hearing and the $3,000 and the kitchen drawer full of notices, about the social media posts he hadn't asked to stop, about the motion filed in partnership with the man trying to destroy her home. She put her phone face down on the table. She picked up her book. She did not respond. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. Because she had spent 18 years responding, adjusting, accommodating, shaping herself around the negative space of what Douglas needed and expected and preferred. And she had learned in the last 3 months that the space she took up when she stopped doing that was larger and more solid than she had remembered it being. She was not going back. On day 12, Voss's consortium made their first offer. $8 million, clean withdrawal of the claim, transfer of the property to the consortium. They would let her keep 2 acres at the rear of the lot. 2 acres out of 320. The 2 acres they had always been willing to give away because they were worthless. Marin called Wendell. Counter, she said. $10 million. We keep the house and the original 2 acres, and I want 2 acres in the commercial district set aside as public green space. Named for Crawford, non-negotiable on the park. Wendell was quiet. Marin, 10 is the top of their range. They may walk. Then they walk. He relayed the terms. The consortium responded within the hour. 9,000,005. No park. Marin looked at the iron key on its cord around her neck. She touched it briefly, the metal warm from her skin. Tell them 10 million. The park is not a bargaining item. It's a condition. Wendell called back 40 minutes later. They accepted. The silence on the line lasted several seconds. They accepted, he said again. Marin was standing in the parlor of the house. The wood stove was going. The floors she had sanded by hand glowed in the firelight. Through the doorway, she could see the dining room floor, the trapdoor, the glass panel Silas had helped her install over it, so the cellar was visible from above. Below the glass, the oak table. The carved box, empty now, its contents distributed across a state circuit court and a law office, and the files of the Crawford House Foundation. She sat down on the floor. The signing happened in Wendell's office on the last Tuesday of March. Outside, the first warmth of a Michigan spring was loosening the ice from the eaves. The sound of meltwater came through the window in an irregular drip that was, after 4 months of silence and wind, almost musical. The settlement agreement was 12 pages. $10 million minus Wendell's contingency percentage, which left Marin with slightly over $7 million, a number so large that looking at it on paper produced a sensation she couldn't name. Like trying to read a word in a language you're just beginning to learn. You can sound out the letters, but the meaning hasn't arrived yet. She picked up the pen. She held it for a moment, the same way she had held the $15 on the bench. The same way she had held the iron key in the cellar. With the full weight of knowing that she was holding something that would change everything, including things she couldn't yet see. She signed. She set the pen down. She looked at Wendell. You believed me when the whole town was laughing. You took a case with no retainer from a woman living in a condemned building because she put a dead man's papers on your desk and asked you to trust her. Wendell removed his glasses and cleaned them with the end of his tie, which was what he did when he needed a moment. You trusted yourself first, he said. I just followed where you led. Marin did not buy a house on the good side of Caldwell. She stayed at 1247 Briarlock Road. She hired contractors. Carefully chosen, most of them, the same people who had worked on the house as volunteers, now paid fairly, working with the same care they had brought in December, when care was all they had to offer. They stabilized the foundation. They rebuilt the second floor completely. They restored the wraparound porch with the gingerbread trim and the tall windows that Elias Crawford had designed to pull in the morning light off the lake. They did not make it modern. They made it what it had been built to be. A Victorian home constructed by a man who intended it to last, and who had been against every effort to prove otherwise correct. In the dining room floor, the trapdoor was covered with a panel of tempered glass set flush with the surrounding boards. Below, visible through the glass, the cellar. The oak table. The carved box, empty but present. A brass plaque mounted on the wall nearby read, "The Crawford Legacy." Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden where proud people will not look. In April, Marin established the Crawford House Foundation. Its offices were in a renovated storefront on Main Street, on land that until recently had belonged to her and which she had released as part of the settlement in exchange for the foundation's permanent lease at $1 per year. The mission was specific: emergency housing assistance, legal advocacy, job training, and small business loans for single mothers in financial crisis. The kind of help she had needed in November, and hadn't had, and had survived without, and didn't want anyone else to have to survive without. The board included Wendell Silas and Agnes Holbrook, who had retired from the clerk's office in March and was now volunteering 3 days a week because, as she put it, she had spent 31 years filing papers for the county, and she wanted to spend whatever years remained filing papers that actually helped someone. Faye graduated in June, valedictorian. She gave a speech that the school principal had reviewed 3 times for appropriateness and approved on the condition that she not use the phrase corrupt legal system, which she agreed to, and then quoted Crawford's journal instead, which accomplished the same thing with considerably more elegance. She was going to law school in the fall. Full scholarship. When people asked why law, she said, "Because someone has to be in the room when one side has 5 lawyers and the other side has 1. And that one has to be good enough to make the difference." Colt enrolled in a vocational program the following September, a combined high school and carpentry apprenticeship that let him work with his hands in the mornings and do his coursework in the afternoons. When his advisor asked why carpentry, he thought about it for a while. The way he thought about everything. Slowly, completely, with the attention of someone who had learned that the right answer was worth waiting for. "Because Silas taught me that what you build with your hands carries your name even when you don't sign it," Colt said. "I want to build things that last, like this house lasted, like the man who built it intended it to." Silas was 75 by then, and his knees had opinions about stairs that he had not had at 74. But he came to the house on Saturdays, and he and Colt worked on whatever needed working on, which, in a Victorian house, was always something, and they did it side by side in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been working together long enough to know each other's methods. As for Douglas, he called twice after the settlement. The first time to ask whether Marin would consider a financial arrangement given his ongoing relationship with the children and his current liquidity situation. The second time to suggest carefully and without specifics that reconciliation might be worth exploring. Marin did not return either call. She had moved past him entirely, not through effort, not through the concentrated work of forgiveness or the staged process of closure that self-help books describe in numbered steps. More simply than that, she had become too interested in her own life to maintain the energy required to keep being angry at his. 1 year to the day after the auction. November, the second week of it. Cold in the way that Caldwell in November is always cold, which is the kind that means it and stays. Marin held a gathering on the porch. Not a party, something quieter and more deliberate. The kind of occasion that doesn't have a name because the things worth marking often don't. She invited Wendell and his wife. She invited Silas, Alvin, Dorothy, Curtis, and everyone who had come to Briarlock Road during those 30 days with tools and knowledge and labor they offered without being asked. She invited 23 women who had received assistance from the Crawford House Foundation in its first 6 months of operation. She invited Agnes Holbrook, who brought a covered dish and the original envelope that had held the iron skeleton key, the envelope with the faded handwriting she had kept in her desk drawer for 31 years, which she presented to Marin without ceremony, which was exactly the right way. Marin spoke from the porch. "No notes. A year ago, I stood in this yard and believed I had made the worst decision of my life." She paused. "I had spent my last $15 on a ruin. Everyone said I was out of my mind, and maybe I was. Maybe desperation is just a word for the kind of courage that doesn't know any better." The porch was quiet. Silas stood at the edge of it, leaning against the railing he had built himself, holding his coffee in the large hands that had been building things for 50 years and hadn't stopped. He looked out at Briarlock Road. His expression was the one Marin had seen only once before, on the first night she read Crawford's journal in the cellar. The recognition of something that has been true for a long time and has finally been said correctly. Elias Crawford hid something in this house more than 100 years ago. He waited longer than any of us can imagine. And I think he was waiting for someone who understood what it meant to have everything taken. Someone who wouldn't walk past a locked door just because someone told her it wasn't worth opening. She stopped. The late November light was going gold at the edges. The oak tree cast its long shadow across the yard. The last leaves of the season drifted across the grass in the slow spiral that happens when the wind drops. "I don't know if I deserved what he left," she said. "I'm not sure that's the right question. The right question is what you do with the thing you find when you're at the bottom. Do you hold it for yourself? Or do you turn it into something that outlasts you?" She looked at the women from the foundation. 23 of them, some with children at their sides, some alone, all of them in some version of the place she had been a year ago, and none of them there yet. Crawford buried his truth because he believed someone would come, and we are all here because he was right. Later, after the guests had gone and the dishes were washed, and Faye and Colt had gone upstairs to rooms that were warm and dry, and theirs, and permanently so, Marin stood alone in the parlor. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. Through the glass panel in the dining room floor, the cellar was dark. The oak table was still there. The carved box, empty, still there. The room that Elias Crawford had sealed from the inside with his own hands in the winter of 1893. The room that had held his secret and his fury and his long, patient faith that truth would outlast the people who buried it. On the wall above the parlor fireplace, 2 things. The $15 bill, the 10 and the 5 soft from years of folding and unfolding, mounted behind glass in a simple oak frame that Silas had made in his workshop, the grain of the wood chosen to match the floors. Below it, on a small iron hook, the skeleton key. Its clover-shaped bow catching the firelight. Its teeth worn smooth by the century it had spent waiting in the dark of a dead man's cellar for someone to find it. And below both, a small brass plaque. 3 words, "Best investment ever." Through the window, the oak tree was a silhouette against a sky going dark and filling up with stars. The kind of sky you only get in places where the lights are few and the darkness is the real thing, not the approximation of it. On the porch between 2 boards that Silas and Colt had laid side by side in December, a cluster of wild asters had pushed through the gap. Small, purple, blooming late the way some things do in the crack between the boards because nobody had told them the season was over. Silas had seen them during the final weeks of work. Marin had asked if they should fill the gap. He had looked at the flowers for a moment, then at her. "Some things grow best in the places nobody planted them," he said. "I'd leave those be." She had left them. They were still there. And in the cooling dark of a November evening, with the house warm behind her and the stars coming out overhead, and her children asleep in rooms they would never be taken from, Marin Ashby closed her eyes and felt something that was not happiness exactly, and not peace exactly, but the place where those 2 things meet. The still point at the center of a life that had been broken apart and put back together piece by piece, nail by nail, choice by choice, into something that held.